Welcome to The Cusp, a podcast that tries to give you the straight dope on what's actually happening with artificial intelligence, how jobs are changing, and what that means for education and workforce development. I'm Paul Fain, editor of the Job Newsletter and co-founder of WorkShift. Thanks for listening. Julia Lane is an economist, professor at NYU's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, and a top expert on public data. She helped lead federal data strategy from a post at the White House and is a co-founder of the Coleridge Initiative, which works with governments on data for decision-making. Lane also recently advised the National Institute of Standards and Technology on President Biden's executive order on AI. So my attention was piqued by an intriguing proposal Lane recently made in the MIT Press Reader. She called for the creation of a new national center on data to measure AI's impacts on jobs, a center that's outside the federal government. I spoke with Lane about which problems the center could address and how it could help to answer the central questions I'm exploring with this podcast. Let's get to the conversation. I'm here with Dr. Julia Lane. Julia, thanks for doing this.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So in my reporting, I've been trying to get an answer on what is actually happening with AI in the labor market. I've struggled to get any firm information there, and I'm gathering that's a recurring theme in your work as well.
That's right. If you want to know what's going to happen with the links between AI and the workforce, I'm here to tell you that I don't know. And the reason I don't know is that we don't have the data to answer that question. What I am going to talk about is the four main data points that we need to be able to answer that question, why it matters, and how we can get there.
Well, that's great. And, I do think it's clarifying to know that nobody knows here. And, obviously we see a lot of projections from management consulting companies, a lot of surveys, some estimates from academics, but they're all over the place. So what do we need to know to have confidence about what's happening?
Okay, so I think there are four things that we need to know to understand. And I should call out Jason Smith at the University of Michigan, who was kind of zeroed in on these as well. The first thing is what proportion of firms are using AI? The second is what proportion of existing tasks and the skills that workers use to perform those tasks could be replaced by AI. The third is what new jobs are going to be created or are likely to be created. And the fourth is how quickly can the existing workforce be retrained? Those are the numbers essentially that make up the pieces that get us to the impact of AI on jobs. And those are the numbers which are currently estimated to wildly different degrees of precision and which we could know a lot better with a different data infrastructure.
So I'm guessing that the federal government's data infrastructure is not up to the task. And, frankly, as a higher ed reporter, it's not up to the task of even understanding where students are going. So but give me a sense of who should be tracking that and what's happening.
So in my MIT Press thing, first of all, I want to give you a sense of why those numbers are so important. You mentioned researchers. So Darren Acemoglu from MIT said that AI would have modest economic payouts, 0.93% of GDP growth. Goldman Sachs, kind of a consulting firm, had numbers that were more than 6 times higher for the same period. So over 10 years, as Jason Ainsworth has pointed out, those differences exceed by more than 60% the GDP of the third largest economy in the world, Germany's. That's a non-trivial number of workers. That's a non-trivial amount of output. So these assumptions make a big deal of difference. And getting better precision is going to make a big difference for, the higher education institutions, apprenticeships, the workers who are struggling to figure out where to spend their energy and time, the kind of things that make a difference in the well-being of all countries and all citizens and all people, but particularly at the low end of the workforce. When you say federal statistical system, what can they do? When I teach my classes, that typically puts them into a coma of indifference. So, but when you say this matters for jobs and for workers, then people perk up and pay attention. So what I was trying to do is to put it in context.
No, I appreciate that. I think give or take a Germany is pretty tough when you're trying to plan to how to change an academic program around, changing labor market.
That's right. So I'd like to unpack the pieces parts into three different areas. The first thing is our federal statistical system and the way in which we capture data on economic activity in the workforce is grounded in a framework that's over 100 years old. That's the core problem. The reason MIT Press asked me to do the essay, which prompted you to reach out to me, is that I wrote a book about this called Democratizing Our Data about 4 or 5 years ago, and they wanted me to update it based on the work that I've been doing in AI. And so in that book, I talk about how we got the unemployment measures, and it was a result of the 1930s Great Depression. The way in which we got our GDP figures, which is the core of productivity estimates, again, was pieced together in the 1930s. So, we're really dealing with a framework that was conceived and a data infrastructure that was conceived a very long time ago. So the challenge, I think, then, once you get the understanding of what the problems are, that then helps you understand why the federal statistical system can't do it. First of all, it's national questions. It was in order to help the Federal Reserve, the president, Wall Street effectively to figure out what was going on. But now our issues are local, right? Labor markets and local. So trying to come up with a national employment or unemployment number makes no sense, because it's like saying on the first Friday of every month, we're going to publish the national temperature in the United States. Every local labor market is different. The workers and the firms are facing local interests. That's the first thing. The second thing is the way in which the questions are being asked really don't make any sense. The interest is in, the quality of jobs, the duration, the upward mobility, and so on.
Right.
The current population survey, which is the source of the main pieces of information, the number that gets published is, were you actively looking for work in the survey week? It's asked of 60,000 households. The respondent in 60,000 households, the response rate's declining. The question, if you think about it, what does actively looking for work even make sense? Who's answering a phone call? And then who is employed is, are you employed for 1 hour of paid work in the survey week? That doesn't tie into really, I think, what the policy interest is do people have good jobs? Are they trying to find good jobs? And it doesn't help us understand any of the mechanisms.
And that's the Census Bureau that's doing that survey.
Well, I'm an economist, so there's actually two answers. It's funded through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So they're the ones who design the questionnaire to be consistent, to be fair, with international standards. And then the Census Bureau is the one that administers the survey. So they have the national frame, and they're the ones who have the field interviewers and collect the data for the BLS. So there's two agencies, BLS and Census.
Got it.
So that ties in really nicely to the third issue, which is the reliance on surveys. 100 years ago, asking people questions for a survey, that was the way in which it was done, even 40 years ago. But the world has changed. The way in which data are made available now is there's tons of transaction data, tons of administrative data. The value of surveys, it's like a shrinking, melting iceberg in terms of the sea of information that's available that could be processed and used to answer the questions much, much better. The last piece I want to mention here is the focus on the federal statistical system. The three things I pointed out are the framework's 100 years old, the framework's national, the focus on surveys is antiquated. But the last piece that people really don't talk about very often is that the Census Bureau imposes this differential privacy, that a statistical confidentiality protection technique that essentially ruins the utility of the data for local labor markets. And I could go into that in mind-numbing detail, but I won't. But I'd like people to think about that.
So can this, I mean, I love the way you describe this. It reminds me of the sagging value of political polling. It reminds me of our physical infrastructure aging in this country. But, can we improve the existing system enough?
The answer is unambiguously yes. We can't improve it by relying on the existing infrastructure. That is like building castles on sand. We've got tremendously good people in the SAT system. They're survey methodologists, statistical experts, because that's what they're trained to do. They're automatically going to go and do surveys to answer questions. You see that in the MIT Press piece. What we really need to go after is a independent data system that is bipartisan, that is designed to respond to the needs of the local labor market, the local businesses, to produce information that is, frankly, responsive to current needs, and that is built on the new types of data that are available.
So why, I have guesses and I read your piece, but why does it need to be independent and nonpartisan? What would gum up the works if it wasn't?
I think have been involved in the federal system for my entire career. And unfortunately, the reality is that it is so difficult to get things done within the federal system. It can take years, even for a survey, to get new information out, to have the agility to make things work. And they're based in Washington. So they're nationally focused. It's insane to think that someone in Washington can figure out what's needed in Galveston, Texas, or in Spokane, Washington, and that you can design something that is going to make sense for every state, for every local area. Think about how NOAA, the National Weather Agency, the National Weather Service,
Yep.
collects data. They set national standards, and then local weather stations collect the information and make sense for them and present them in ways that make sense to the local areas.
Right.
So, if you're in Sacramento, they'll publish air quality indices and they'll produce it in a way that their constituency will read and will understand. The reason I chose the Galveston example, Galveston, Texas, is in 1900, everything was centralized in Washington for the National Weather Service. They forecast that a hurricane was going to hit Florida. It actually hit Galveston, Texas. They had no local information that was available. And obviously, thousands of Americans died as a result of inadequate data and a national centralized system. In response to that cataclysm, the National Weather Service redesigned the way in which they did their data collection and reporting, and that's why we have the system we have now. I've argued we really need to rethink the way in which we collect and produce data so that when we have these cataclysms, these economic, maybe cataclysms, maybe just little, blips, we don't know. The way in which to figure that out is with a different type of data infrastructure.
That's a great analogy. I didn't know that history of the National Weather Service, but you're not someone who's opposed generally to federal initiatives. You're no stranger to Washington, but I'm just curious why you think a newly envisioned federal system with local data inputs wouldn't work from inside the federal government.
Well, and let me be clear, I'm not proposing throwing out the current system. We need it for consistency, high quality inference, or all kinds of good things associated with it. I think the success of an independent entity is predicated on a complementary activity with the federal system. The former US chief statistician, Nancy Potok, with whom I've worked very closely, has recommended a federally funded research data center approach, kind of like the national lab system, which has the flexibility to move and create data without the burden of being inside the federal system. So there are very successful models of these, what's called FFRDCs, that I recommend in the book. The other approach that has been very successful is federally funded institutes that have also been set up with philanthropic foundation funding. Let me take two examples I cite in the piece. One is the Urban Institute, and the second is MDRC, which used to be called the Manpower Development Research Corporation. Those were set up to answer very specific questions. So Department of Labor had questions they needed to answer. Ford Foundation wanted to help them figure out how to answer them. Joint funding from DOL and the Ford Foundation set up the Urban Institute.
When was that? What
That
year was that?
has got to be in the late 1970s.
Gotcha.
MDRC was earlier. It was maybe in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Was set up with funding from Human Services and the Ford Foundation. What they did was they gave back then what was a substantial amount of money, $30 or $40 million, to set up those institutions to answer the questions. And they've been spectacularly successful in providing that flexibility. The problem that they have is they're forced to work with the existing data infrastructure, or they develop new approaches to collecting data that are one-off and then that get buried. So there's been millions of dollars wasted on one-offs. What I'm proposing here is the same kind of approach, philanthropic foundation or a set of philanthropic foundations that are interested in the education workforce issues, set up an independent institute that is focused on building data and the analytics on top. And that's what the MIT Press thing is proposing.
And give me a sense, I don't want to get to the specifics of how that might work, but the extent to which AI's influence on the labor market is driving the urgency here to do this. I mean, how much of that would be a focus of such a national center?
Well, I think AI has focused everyone's attention. It's focused everyone's attention on what we don't know. So of those 4 questions, simply that first one, which is how much are firms using AI? The Census Bureau estimates, and if you take a look at the MIT piece and take a look at the question that is asked, my guess is that the Census Bureau estimate of 5% of firms use AI is unlikely to reflect reality. It is likely to reflect the response of someone who is asked to answer questions that are fundamentally unknowable and just decides to skip the question, right?
It does seem low.
You get it? So they come up with a number of 5%. But when Goldman Sachs asked companies how many people are using AI in an unscientific way, the CEOs are saying 90% of their firms are using AI. So you're somewhere between 90% and 5%.
That's more than Germany.
It's more than Germany. So the basic idea here is you would put together existing data sources, and I can talk a little bit more about what that might look like, that gets you at least a more closely triangulated number that gives you better estimates. The idea here is get the data pieces together that don't rely on surveys. You might use a little bit of surveys to triangulate things, which the MIT people have been working on, and then get the best minds, kind of fellowships from around the world, around the country, to come in and kick the tires to see if it makes sense. So it's not just inside people within a statistical agency. You open up the mechanisms to the broader society.
How fast, in a best case scenario, if done right, could a center like this really get up and running and provide meaningful data?
Well, so the good news is there's a lot of these efforts that have already been started. The Institute for Research on Innovation and Science at the University of Michigan has been around for 10 years. They've been collecting a lot of the data. They're doing a pilot project with the states and with the National Science Foundation, Technology Innovation Partnership Program, Department of Labor's, looking at doing a bunch of stuff. There are tons of separate efforts that could be put together. NASWA, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, has put together multi-state regional collaboratives. So I think it's essentially a matter of getting the institution set up and get the core data infrastructure put in place, probably a year and a half, and then get some runs on the board, and then you build success. And I've spent a career doing this kind of thing. So Tris Messerol from Brookings set up the Frontier Model Forum to look at machine learning models. He put that together very quickly. So there are precedents to do this.
And in the 4 types of data, questions to ask with data that you raised in the beginning, I mean, some of the quick runs I would assume would be around the proportion of firms that are using it. I mean, are there harder questions that might take more time?
You're asking great questions and keeping the eye on the ball. So the proportion of firms that work on AI, I think the Iris team has been starting to answer some of those questions with some skill. The proportion of existing talent that could be replaced by AI, this is public knowledge. I'm on the Secretary of Labor's Workforce Innovation Advisory Committee. One of their recommendations is to combine the job listings that firms put out, combined with the resumes that job seekers are putting out. That gives you some sense of the mismatch between workers and firms, and it gives you some sense of where the in-demand jobs are going, the tasks, because that's part of the job listings,
Yep.
and the experience and the skills. Part of what you could do there is combine that with the unemployment wage records and get a close to real-time set of information that can be produced. Those data exist. Private sector firms like Revelio Labs have been disambiguating them, resolving them. States like New Jersey, Leslie Hirsch in New Jersey has built a career navigator using their data. Texas, Arkansas has done a brilliant job of combining this information. And the NASWA's multi-state regional collaboratives are putting those data sets together, transferring knowledge. So that piece, I think, could be done reasonably quickly. How many new jobs are likely to be created? I don't know. That's going to be a harder one, but you can get people much smarter than me to come in and try and figure out that. That's the point of getting the best minds in as fellowships to do an environmental scan. Look at the incredible brains, Orta, Asimoglu, Mollick, Brynjolfsson, Heidi Williams. There are so many very smart people thinking about that could really kick the tires. And, obviously I'm a New Zealander. What about the foreigners? What's
Sure.
the role of immigration on this? And then how quickly could existing workers be retrained? I think there's a lot of knowledge about that. You've talked a lot on your show about apprenticeships. Josh Hawley from Ohio State and a bunch of people have talked about the importance of certificates, the role of community colleges, the credential engine work that Lumina has funded. Those pieces, I think, could be joined together instead of having disparate blobs that essentially all are fascinating, but integrating them into a responsive data infrastructure that is designed to answer the questions that people have is going to be essential. So, of the 4 things, I think 1, proportion of firms, that can be done relatively quickly. Proportion of existing tasks, that's on deck, and people are thinking about how to do that. That could be done relatively quickly. How quickly could existing workers be retrained? Consolidating a lot of the existing knowledge, that's feasible in the data infrastructure we're talking about. Jobs created, that needs some serious work.
Well, honestly, like you, I'm relieved to hear that it's not just us who are struggling to find any firm answers on any of this, that it's really just not there. But we have heard from a lot of folks who are really struggling with preparing for what is a moving target and everything from 5 to 90% on estimates. So the need for this is pretty clear to me. And I'm just wondering, you've got that piece up on the MIT Reader Press. You just begun talking about this idea. Any interest from philanthropy, from researchers in making this happen?
Sure. I'm not going to name names, but yes, there have been people who've been reaching out. One of the thoughts has come up is to have a conference, philanthropists, and to take it to the next step. So that would be a really good thing to do. I should point out, 20 years ago, I was working with the New Zealand government. Not
Mhm.
surprisingly, I had been putting together what's called the LEHD program at the Census Bureau, which is the linked employee data set. And I was working with the Ministry of Labour in New Zealand. They started to build something called linked employee data, LEAD.
Mhm.
Bill English, who was the Minister of Finance, took that and worked to produce the integrated data infrastructure. This year, they used that integrated data infrastructure, which pulled together data from multiple sources to create a comprehensive picture of what's going on in New Zealand. And they have now put together a Ministry of Social Investment that got established this year based on the IDI.
Wow.
So what I'm trying to say is, this is not pie in the sky. We built LEHD. We built IRIS. We built the Coleridge Initiative. We built in New Zealand an entire infrastructure that is evidence and data-based. And I think with the impetus of philanthropic foundations, building something like this, it could transform our understanding of what's going on. So it's not just wishful thinking, it is informed by past experience.
Well, certainly resonates with what I'm hearing, and including interest among major philanthropic organizations in helping to prepare the less resourced institutions and workers and students for what's coming. So I'm cautiously optimistic you'll get some interest here.
Well, my argument is, let's just do it. Let's not just talk about it. Let's do it. I'm going to close with one example. I'm taking a Spanish class on Saturday mornings. And in that class, was a young man, African American, who turned out he started off wanting to do engineering. Then he switched to computer science, and then he decided those jobs were disappearing. So he's going into data science. So he found out I knew something about it. He asked for help, but the social networks are not as strong in some communities as in other communities.
Sure.
There's no information. There's no information for a kid like that to make decisions. And it really brought it home to me. This is really not just an academic discussion. It's affecting people's lives.
Absolutely.
He doesn't know what to spend his time in. He's 22 years old. He's asking me in a Spanish class, what should I do? Well, what about the thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids where the stuff that's coming out of the statistical agencies is not helpful, and the people at the local level don't have the information to give to people in the local areas? We can transform that. This is the United States. You've got the power, the energy, and the skills to do it.
We can still do things here. Yeah, I'll tell you.
Yeah, you can.
Anyone who is talking with early career young folks or children can resonate with what you just said. I literally had this conversation with my daughter about, how occupations today are going to change, like how teaching is going to change or medical billing. There are a lot of questions that I think people really need answers now. So I'm sold.
Yep.
Dr. Lane, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Thanks for tuning into The Cusp. We're available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe. You can visit us at thecusp.ai. The launch of this podcast was made possible by the collective philanthropic support of the Walmart Foundation, GitLab Foundation, Cognizant, and the Capeware Center. Thanks to our supporters and to you all for listening. Catch you next time.